Hi everyone, this is a conversation between me, Brian Tomasik, and Magnus Vinding. We're going to talk about non-human animals, the far future, and other topics. This is partly a discussion to resolve our disagreements and partly to share ideas that we think are important. So I was going to start with some questions about non-human animals. The first one is, Magnus, what are your thoughts on the possibility of insect suffering?
Yeah, my thoughts are that it's an extremely important subject because, I mean, not least because or mainly because of the number of insects who exist. I think, yeah, you've written that it's something like a billion that I think it's estimated that who live on Earth, and I think that's, I mean, it may well be the majority of suffering on the planet if there is such a term makes sense, but yeah, I think it's potentially a very huge problem that anyone concerned about suffering with anyone should take seriously.
Mm-hmm. And what are your thoughts on, and so I guess my view is that I agree. Later we'll discuss a little bit about how we might disagree on the interpretation of insect suffering in terms of uncertainty about whether insects can suffer. But for now, it seems we both agree that given the numbers, even if we only care about insects a small amount per individual, or even if we only assign a small probability to some notion of consciousness, then they could still matter quite a bit.
Yeah, so, and I think concerning probabilities, I think it's worth noting that we really can't, I mean, the uncertainty is just quite big, and I think it's not, just as it's not easy to say that insects are sentient, well, that's my view anyway. It's also not easy to exclude the possibility that they are, intensely so, and just as much as you and I. You know. So I think the uncertainty cuts both ways now, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's of course another reason to take it very seriously and to research, to make more research into the subject, which I guess that's really perhaps a question I could ask you, but maybe that's for later, how we might be able to make more qualified estimates about that question. But yeah, I guess that does tie into a deeper discussion about the subject of sentience.
Yeah, I guess we can tackle that later.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on ways that people can help insects, both in daily life and with broader choices, like policy decisions or food choices or things like that?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I've thought disappointingly little about this subject, but I mean, I guess what I can say is the most obvious thing, of course, is that if one sees an insect, then one can try to do what's best in that case, which is not necessarily to I mean, leave them be, because I mean, it may be the case that an insect is suffering harm, and in that case, I think it's much more ethical to end it humanely and as quickly as possible. It's looking away is not and just leaving them alone and letting them live. That's not always the best thing.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on the relative painfulness of being squished versus dying in other ways?
Yeah, I think that's actually quite a serious issue, because I think my view is that in very intense suffering can be, I would even say infinitely worse than just mild forms. So that could speak for choosing not to squish an insect. But on the other hand, I would also say that who's to say that the alternative way of dying is necessarily better. I think that there's a lot of uncertainty there also. So, but yeah, I think that's something to, I mean, take very seriously also. But again, I don't know, unfortunately, how to deal with that situation and those kinds of uncertainties.
Yeah, my own view on that has changed over time, and I'm still very uncertain. In the past, I used to think it was probably best to squish insects because it was so much shorter to die that way than to dehydrate or starve or die in other ways that insects might be killed through old age. After that, I became a little less certain and inclined toward not squishing them on a few grounds. One is the point that you made that I think intense suffering is much worse per unit time than mild suffering, maybe more than other people tend to judge it to be. And from that perspective, assuming, say, dehydration or something is assuming the peak suffering intensity of dehydration is never equal to the intensity of squishing, which seems plausible, then maybe dehydration could be better. I'm just using dehydration as an example. I'm not sure exactly in what ways most insects die, but Jeffrey Lockwood, an entomologist, has mentioned that dehydration could be one such way. Another data point is that humans sometimes die by dehydration or starvation in hospice care, for example, when people want to end their lives without euthanasia, but also don't want to go on life support. They may go without water or food. And people often claim that that's not too bad as a way to die in relative terms. Of course, it's probably still bad in an absolute sense. And I'm not sure how much stock to give those claims, but it does seem reasonable that the bodily breakdown from those processes might be pretty gradual. And I guess in the end, you'd have some sort of organ failure that would finish you off. So it would be important to know how painful that would be. For insects, they have maybe less pronounced organs, and so death takes a long time. Jeffrey Lockwood has also made that point that like worms or other invertebrates have pretty decentralized nervous systems, pretty decentralized like organ systems. And so it can take a lot longer for an insect to die than a human, because with a human, you cut off blood to the brain within, I don't know, minutes at most, the human is dead. But with insects, there's a lot more oxygen flow without, heart pumping blood necessarily. And they also conserve energy a lot better, being poikothermic rather than endothermic. So there are a lot of ways in which insects degrade much slower than people. On the flip side, you might also think, especially if the insect is in cold temperatures or something, that it might undergo less experience per unit time if it's, say, dying of cold, because the body slows down, and so if processing is slower, then maybe brain processing is also slower. So that might reduce the importance, at least in the case of cold or something.
Yeah, I should also add that my point about euthanizing insects was mainly in the context of where the insects seem to be in intense pain already. That's what I was thinking of, right, anyway. But I think you're right that it's actually true anyways, because even if things seem to be going fine, so to speak, things are going to go downhill either way.
Yeah, another consideration when thinking about killing bugs is you don't want to be in a situation where you increase total deaths per unit time necessarily, because so if you imagine, especially when you're thinking about healthy insects, if you have a model where the insect population is at its maximum, then if you kill one insect, it'll be replaced by some other one. And so if you imagine, say, killing all the insects at half their average lifespan, then you would basically on average double the mortality rate per year. and therefore at least almost double, say, the amount of suffering per year. So that model has many assumptions, but at least it suggests that there's some reason to be cautious about killing, especially insects that may not be at the end of their lives. Some counterpoints to that could be if the insect population is not at its maximum and it's variable, then if you kill a healthy insect, it might not have children, and therefore it might like you might prevent more total insects down the road and more total deaths down the road. So it's not always clear how to make these decisions.
No, and I think this also speaks to another point, namely that for all these uncertainties, I think it's then pretty clear what's, something that isn't that uncertain compared to that is that it seems that destroying plants would quite clearly amount to fewer insects. So that seems like, I don't know, a pretty guaranteed win as far as that exists.
Yeah, I agree. Going to the root of the problem, as they say, with the pun intended, seems more robust in that sense. Because when this is true for interventions to help wild animals in general, when you try to affect something at the top or in the middle of the trophic chain, you don't reduce the total amount of input, so you still have the same amount of plant food up to some approximation. That may not totally be true, but for example, if you keep the amount of plant food constant, then except for inorganic decomposition of that food, somebody's going to eat it at some point. That might be mostly bacteria, though, depending on the situation, and we might or might not care about bacteria. And in my case, I do care about bacteria, but I care about them less per gram, say, than insects. So so those are factors to consider as well. But especially if you do care about bacteria, then in some ways, the only sure way to reduce populations would be to reduce plant biomass, or to burn the biomass in the sense that burning is a non-living way to destroy stored plant energy, something like that. But that's a good point in general, that the biomass targeted interventions, I think, are the most robust, both in the insect case and in general for wild animals. Although that's not to say that intervening in higher layers can't also affect biomass. For example, I often say that it seems plausible that reducing predation of large herbivores is a good thing, because large herbivores eat a lot of plants, and they may eat food that otherwise would be eaten by other animals. And insofar as they eat lots of plants, they may hinder plant growth. So that can be reducing predators or avoiding reintroducing predators can be a way to affect biomass that's not directly targeted at the plants themselves.
Yeah, and it's of course also worth noting that even though I don't know how to put it, less biomass is perhaps the most robust in terms of reducing suffering directly. I mean, if it is possible, it's not necessarily the most robust strategy at the level of, at the social level. It sounds insane to most people. And I don't know how to. Because I guess none of us have really been particularly aggressive about advocating for that at all. And I think that's quite reasonable. You've written about it, but it's not like you have made, what can I say? It's not always that clear. It's.
Yeah, well, so I think I wouldn't rule out doing a more widespread effort in the future. I think what's more important in the short term is research and making ourselves more confident about given interventions. But like especially in cases where there's existing disagreement, it doesn't seem like it would be necessarily wildly unpopular. For example, one of the most clear-cut cases is rewilding efforts, where people actively add back forests or other wildlife areas. And in that case, the intervention is on the opposite side of what helps wild animals, and it costs money to do that intervention. It costs money to do rewilding. So our position is on the side of the status quo, which tends to help, and then also is less expensive. And then there are other more mundane cases, like say if a shopping mall wants to build over a wetland and put parking lots there. There are many human interests in favor of the shopping mall. It's not as though nobody's in favor of eliminating that habitat. So from that perspective, it might not be totally radical. The reason might be radical, but the policy advocated is fairly mundane in that sense. I mean, it's common for people to have disputes over development and things like that. From that perspective, it seems possible to intervene in these issues at a bigger scale once we have more confidence. I'm not sure if they're the most cost-effective interventions, especially since you might make enemies, and maybe it's better to focus on promoting concern for animals, especially in the future, and reducing the likelihood that humans spread wild animal suffering elsewhere. But at least it's on the table and something to think about. And getting a better handle on these wild animal issues can also affect indirectly what kinds of policies we advocate, such as veg outreach or poverty reduction or family planning. All these other causes are importantly related to environmental issues. And so getting a better handle on the environmental side effects of them would be important for knowing whether to scale up or scale down how much people work on those.
Yeah, but I guess it's really, I mean, in one sense, I think what we're challenging could almost be called something like the biggest religion of our time, at least in secular societies, because it is as though that nature has become deified, and there is this weird presumption that nature must somehow be benevolent, and what's going on there is just, it's got to be good somehow. And that just seems yeah, so strong and so strangely universally accepted. I mean, especially among biologists, it seems, actually. You know, conservation biology is a field. Welfare biology isn't. I mean, really. So, and it's, yeah, without any justification, it's just yeah, assumed to be good.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it purely from the human perspective, it's often the case, at least relative to existing humans, it's often the case that environmental destruction is harmful, at least on the margin. I think most people would agree we shouldn't go back to living in the forest or something with huts to reduce our environmental impact. So maybe many current forms of environmental destruction are net beneficial to humans, at least in the short term. But I think the religion of environmentalism often comes from practical cases where environmental destruction does harm humans. So I think it's a lot to do with speciesism rather than religion per se, although I agree there's also a big religious element or spiritual element to reverence for nature and things like that.
But I think I have to ask what you mean by speciesism then in that context, because I've argued the exact opposite, that it's really conservationism that is the speciesist position.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, okay.
If you only evaluate environmental issues from a human standpoint, then environmental conservation can often be a good way to go.
Yeah, and I think it's really just bizarre because, I don't know, it's like in these various discourses and these efforts of advocacy, it's as though nature is being treated as some kind of collector's object. I mean, and you see that when they seem especially concerned about rare species and about, well, we can't lose them. And so is it for your sake or is it for their sake? It's like I don't know, it's this rare edition they gotta keep. I don't know, it seems very bizarre to me.
Yeah, it seems an extension of humans' general tendency to want to preserve rare things. I mean, there's also antique collectors and people who care a lot about the first edition of the Mona Lisa and like religious artifacts. This was this object touched by a saint in the past or whatever. So there are a lot of ways in which humans have these special attachments to inanimate or at least non-conscious, or what most people consider non-conscious objects. So it's probably what you described in particular is maybe an extension of that.
Yeah, perhaps. I guess I should really be in a position to understand them actually, because when I must have been 7 years or something, 7 years old, my biggest passion was tigers, almost ironically now, but yeah, and I really, really cared about tigers more than anything, and I read about how they, had gone extinct in all these various places, and so I was really a big fan of tigers. So I guess I actually, in some sense, came from that position, that view. But
that was true for me. I grew up watching environmental documentaries, and I remember being pretty young, like maybe 4 or 5. I watched a documentary about animals in Africa, and it was said that some species had only a few hundred members left or something, and I remember being sad about that. And in general, I was a strong environmentalist until age 18 or so. I grew up thinking I would be an environmental activist when I grew up, because I thought environmentalism was maybe the most important issue from the standpoint of human well-being. So before age 18, I didn't even think about animal welfare as a serious topic, and I didn't even know that animals could suffer, because I thought maybe you needed language to be conscious. And so at the time, I was mainly focused on human suffering, and I thought poverty was important to reduce, but I also worried that poverty reduction might increase overpopulation and therefore harm future generations. So I thought that the most important issue was probably environmentalism, specifically big issues like global warming that will clearly hurt lots of people. And I'm not sure if I agree with that now, given the fact that the future will be richer and therefore better able to handle these long-term problems. But it still seems to be the case that from a human perspective, environmentalism is often positive. So I was president of my environmental club from sophomore to senior year of high school. And I worked on a project to encourage my school district to use recycled paper in its printers, to move from 30% to 100% post-consumer waste recycled paper. And I wrote up a long piece about the benefits of recycled paper and sent a letter to the school board, and it was discussed at one of the board meetings. And then there was an article in the local newspaper about my efforts.
Yes.
Yeah, so even in college, the first year of college, I was a member of the environmental club there, and I had just started caring about animals, and I assumed that it was natural to value environmentalism from an animal perspective, because that's what almost all animal rights people tend to think. There are certainly exceptions to that, like there have been some academic pieces about the conflict between animal rights and environmentalism. And there are some classic cases like animal rights people oppose culling deer, hunting deer to reduce their populations and things. But on the whole, it's generally assumed that animal rights people should usually support environmentalism. And so in the beginning of beginning of college, I thought we should preserve habitats because animals in the wild are net happy. And so I'm increasing happiness by supporting habitat conservation. So throughout high school, I had written lots of letters to Congress in support of wilderness preservation and things like that. And I continued to do that a little bit in college. And then in 2006, after my first year, I thought more about wild animal suffering. I encountered David Pearce's writings on the topic. I read Towards Welfare Biology by Yu Kwang Eng, which argues for dominance of suffering over happiness. And I otherwise just thought about the issue more and took insect suffering seriously, which also inclined toward a more pessimistic view. And so those factors together led me to conclude that there's a net balance of suffering in nature, which uprooted a lot of my previous policy stances. So at that time, I drafted what is now the essay called The Importance of Wild Animal Suffering. It was a much earlier version of it. And put that on my newly created website, thanks to David Pearce. Since then, people have taken increasing interest in the topic.
Yeah, that's good to see. By the way, you also got more negative views during that period, right? I mean,
yeah. Although I often try to emphasize that I think even most non-negative utilitarians should think that there's a net balance of suffering in nature. It's sometimes confusing because I'm also a negative utilitarian. So people might assume that only negative utilitarians should feel that way.
I think that's a good point. Whether you are a classical or negative utilitarian or even a deontologist, it's, you know, being eaten alive is pretty bad either way.
Yeah, and from a classical utilitarian standpoint, I think it's plausible that big, long-lived animals like elephants or lions or things have net positive lives relative to most people's estimation. But
lions, I doubt that. I mean, I doubt it in general, but yeah. But I think that's also. Sorry, what?
Because they get eaten by the males, or?
Because only 1 in 8 male lion cubs make it into adulthood. Yeah, so it's. Yeah, I don't see. I mean, if classical utilitarianism means disregarding intense suffering, I mean, then there's no saving it.
But, yeah. I guess I mean classical utilitarianism using the judgments that the median person would use, which
who hasn't experienced those things. I mean, that's really, I guess, an important part of it. Someone who hasn't at all, has no knowledge of what's actually going on, because it's easy to be unqualified, right? But I guess you could say in terms of the median presently, actual classical utilitarianism, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess there's a distinction between what's true and then what people with current beliefs would conclude. Although I do maintain modesty about what's true as well. Although as we'll discuss later, what's true is also subjective, but I think there's a little bit of objectivity as well.
That's an interesting discussion.
But so, for example, you could define what's true as if that person were to experience those things, what would that person conclude? Although it's very dependent on when you ask that person. Probably most people being eaten would say, my life wasn't worth it. I wish I hadn't been born. And there's no unique standpoint from which to say that this judgment is more, we prefer this judgment over that judgment about whether your life has been worthwhile. And that's why, in general, critiques of negative utilitarianism, I think, fail because, for example, Toby Ord might say, relative to people's own judgments, they prefer to experience some amount of suffering rather than not have existed in return for some amount of pleasure. But the problem is, if the suffering is sufficiently intense, then for some moments that person would reverse that judgment, and so there's no unique decision being made. It's many different moments so that person have different opinions on the question. And so it's always hurting one person moment to help another person moment.
Yeah, and that's actually an important point that I've also been thinking about, because I think generally when we talk about ethics, there is a difference when it comes to harming another. I mean, for instance, I think it's generally accepted that I mean, imposing suffering for the sake of pleasure may be called many things, but ethical is not among them, I think. And I think most people certainly agree about that when it comes to other people. But then if one looks closer at this problem of identity, I think that the distinction between other people and then, yeah, this one's previous or future self, I mean, that distinction really blurs. And so...
Especially if you disagree with your past self.
Yeah.
Like regret your past decision. Yeah, so personal identity can go two ways. One view is empty individualism, which is the view that all person moments are sort of distinct individuals and there's no identity over time. And so if you take that view, then the egalitarian intuitions against harming one to help another reinforce a negative utilitarian kind of position, because any amount of suffering for later pleasure is always one person moment suffering at the expense of another for another's benefit. Yeah. But if you instead take the view called open individualism, in which it's said that everybody is a single individual, like the whole universe is one individual and we're all parts of this same individual, then you might take the extreme opposite view and say egalitarianism doesn't matter because we're all the same person. So there's no such thing as inequality. And then you'd have more the view that people tend to take with regard to their own selfish trade-offs.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I don't see such a strong distinction between those two views, actually. I mean, I think I can say that my view is pretty much both of those at the same time in one sense. But I would just say that the latter implications that you mentioned, I don't think they really follow. I think it's a bit of, I don't know, more laziness perhaps to say that kind of thing. I mean, you would have to be somewhat ignorant about what's actually going on for others. Yeah, because then you'd also have to factor in that it's still, perhaps it's me, but that doesn't mean, I mean, that doesn't give me knowledge about what that me in that form then actually feels, right? So you'd still have to be humble in that sense, I think, and still respect the other, even though it's you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But at least suffering that's low enough in intensity that, so for example, say I want to visit my friend, but I have to travel by plane and I get a little bit nauseous on the plane or something, but I still judge that it's worth it. And even during the plane flight, I continue to judge that the suffering is worth the benefit. Then in that case, from the ordinary common sense view of trade-offs, you would say that's a trade-off worth making. And then from a open individualism perspective, we could also say one person experiencing that degree of nausea for someone else's benefit would also be worth it.
Yeah, and that actually touches upon another thing that I've also been thinking about, struggling a bit with, whether it should make a difference, whether, for instance, I mean, if we say that rather than being serial, that you have in serial terms that there's pleasure at one point and then pain at another point, what if it happens in parallel? You know, you have both the pain and the pleasure at the same time. Does that change things? Or yeah, because it seems to me, I don't know, intuitively to me, it seems to make that less bad somehow in my view. But I'm not sure I can really defend that. But it just seems that at least then you know what you're talking about in that instance. Yeah, I mean, an intuitive argument would go.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I would say that there are subsystems of the brain that are net suffering, subsystems that are net enjoying themselves. But then they sort of get combined by some sort of aggregation network. And then the follow-on effects would be different from purely experiencing the suffering. So for example, if you have suffering and happiness at the same time, you're not going to produce output statements of the sort that I wish I weren't experiencing this, or like I wish I were dead in the extreme case, and other sorts of behavior would be different. So I think the whole is not the sum of its parts, but it's also, so I think the lower level parts would be some happiness and some suffering, but then at the higher level, you would have some sort of mixed outputs. I mean, the outputs would be the result of the average, not the individual components. So
yeah, and I think it's still interesting then whether this one system enjoying itself is justified in imposing, I mean, or causing this state to the part very much not enjoying itself. Right? So I just think that's an interesting thing to think about and to push one's intuitions with a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you take my view, I guess we'll get into this later, but if you take my view that all subsystems of the universe could be seen as conscious in some sense, then it becomes even harder to deal with these problems, because you're always going to have some systems that are suffering in some vague sense, no matter what you do. But shall I continue with some animal questions, or?
Yeah, let's go ahead with the non-human beings. Yeah.
So we discussed how many animal rights supporters, or at least my view is that many animal rights supporters believe that conservation is consistent with their support of animal rights. I mean, the naive view is that when you bulldoze a rainforest, say like in Fern Gully movie or something, you're going to destroy, you're going to kill the animals there, and that certainly causes intense suffering to them. And in other ways, pollution or eutrophication, killing fish or whatever, when humans affect ecosystems, they certainly cause short-term suffering almost inevitably. So that naive view tends to be translated to the view that environmentalism is consistent with animal rights or animal welfare. And so this is particularly concerning from the standpoint of efforts to promote concern for animals, for example, by veg outreach, but also more generally. The concern is that if you don't also include a wild animal message as part of that, then people might adopt the standard view, which is also the view of many non-animal rights supporters, namely that environmental conservation is good. And in general, there's a memeplex of liberal values that tend to include animal rights, environmentalism, other kinds of liberal social policies. And so without actively trying to avoid that outcome, it seems plausible to me that promoting veganism or animal rights in general will increase support for environmental conservation, at least to some extent. And so that calls into doubt. It doesn't say that promoting such views are bad, but it at least makes one worried about the possibility.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a reasonable concern, but at the same time, I mean, it certainly depends on what kind of advocacy you're supporting, right? Because I think if one does promote anti-speciesism, well, then and you really think things through, of course, which is often hard, but then I think it's really quite clear that leaving them alone. I think that's a very, very simple argument that really isn't an option. I mean, you would never leave a human alone who's getting eaten alive. You just wouldn't do that, or a dog. So why then would you let an elephant be eaten alive? I mean, it's just such a simple argument, and I haven't heard any response other than those who try to bite the bullet and say, well, I'll just let some lion eat my dad. I don't mind. Which is, I don't know. Then,
but the problem is, empirically, very few animal supporters have adopted that conclusion.
That's true. That's true. But then I'd also say, generally, I mean, such advocacy hasn't been anti-speciesist in nature at all. I mean, it really hasn't. I mean, the term speciesism is quite common, but I think, and that's also one reason that I wrote a book about it, was actually to try to work out what are actually the most basic, most obvious implications of actually taking it seriously, which pretty much, I mean, very few people have actually done that, taking the time and looked at the things.
But even like if you look at the more committed animal advocates, like they take anti-speciesism pretty seriously, but they don't usually come to the conclusion that we should help wild animals. I mean, almost uniformly, the response is we would make things worse.
That's true, but then I would say then that they really haven't taken anti-speciesism seriously, but they just have in a very limited context. So I would say that they haven't taken it seriously. They haven't really followed through.
Yeah, that makes sense, except for the extreme environmentalists who also think it's okay to harm humans for the sake of the environment to avoid, even from a human perspective. But that's a pretty rare position that's unpopular to advocate. So, I mean, for example, so like in the animal case, people might say we need wolves because they prevent deer from overpopulating, and that's good for the long-term health of the deer because then they won't starve in the winter and all those things.
Yeah.
So an analogous argument would say malaria is okay because it keeps the human population in check, and overpopulation is going to harm a lot of people in the future when we run out of resources. So we shouldn't try to intervene with natural causes of human death. No. So it's rare to adopt that latter position. So.
Yeah, and however, that is still, I would maintain, a species then ultimately bigoted position, because no one has yet volunteered to go out and get eaten by the wolves themselves. So it's still basically, just bigotry.
Well, maybe they think if they stay around, they can get more people eaten by wolves. But yeah, I mean, these are pretty unpopular. So
yeah, maybe that's what they're thinking. It's not my turn yet.
So yeah, I guess that's a good point, that people don't internalize anti-speciesism. I mean, maybe the response would say it's simply not possible given current resource constraints to help wild animals in a similar way as we can't even get people to help humans in the third world very much.
So, and that's true, but nonetheless, one can still think about the issue, right? And start to at least try to work out, well, and do as much as you can, right? Because you often hear that then, well, I can't save the world, so I'll just do nothing and watch Netflix. I often hear that. And that doesn't really follow.
Yeah, and there are few people advocating leaving third world societies alone, not intervening in them. I guess there are some people, but like there are some people who say development aid makes things worse or whatever. But it's generally the case that people, especially liberal-minded people, favor intervening in the third world to reduce suffering, but not the analogous case with animals.
Not human animals.
Right, yeah. And so people might also say, well, the ecosystems are too complicated, but human societies and economics are also extremely complicated. It's very hard to get these questions right in the human case either. So it seems to be mainly a difference in something else than the intrinsic difficulty of the problem. I mean, it would be easier to sterilize deer to reduce overpopulation. I mean, unless you're opposed to sterilization as well on anti-species grounds, but like we have a lot more options to manage animal populations than non-human animal populations than human populations.
Yeah, I mean, it's problematic either way. So, but yeah, I like the general heuristic of thinking, well, what would we say in the case of humans, right? Given modulo that they're in a similar situation.
Yeah, but then that's problematic if we extend it to reducing habitat, because reducing habitat inevitably hurts some animals, and we wouldn't destroy human habitat even if it would prevent a much greater amount of suffering later.
there are trade-offs, but you say we wouldn't do that? I'm not so sure. I mean,
well, most people would think it's morally bad.
yeah, but I mean, what's the justification? I mean, doesn't take war, for instance. I mean, I know most people are against war generally, but I guess it's also the case that most people do favor war in some circumstances anyways. I mean, to prevent a nuclear war, don't you think most people would be in favor of some kind of quote unquote habitat destruction, human habitat destruction? I think so.
Yeah, yeah. But I think it might be different. So in war, people's revenge instincts can be triggered. People have a different moral attitude toward those who are evil in their minds. So if you're aggressed upon, then whereas before hurting you would have been morally bad, now hurting you may be morally acceptable or even morally good, depending on how vengeful you are. But there's not an analogous situation with preventing natural harms. So like if you knew that, say you knew a village would devolve into extreme unhappiness for many generations to come. I mean, extreme suffering far exceeding happiness for many generations to come. People still probably wouldn't want to destroy that habitat to prevent all that future suffering.
Yeah, maybe that's true. I mean, it of course depends on who you ask. Like, I mean, I guess most utilitarians would at least say yes. But
yeah. Ignoring social side effects, which are less prevalent in the non-human animal case. So, for example, one important reason not to destroy a human habitat would be a human habitat, assuming it would give rise to massive amounts of suffering in the future, would be the people there would know what you're doing and they would be fearful of it, and you would instill fear in other neighboring societies about whether they would be targeted. And in general, it might lead to a breakdown of social order, whereas in the non-human case, it's mainly the direct harm that's the problem, and you're not going to have those kind of ripple effects. So there is an important disanalogy there.
yeah, and I think certain healthy intuitions may also make this thought experiment a little bit difficult, because most people would probably also somewhere in the back of their minds have this notion, but is it really going to prevent a lot of suffering? I mean, destroying this, what's the reason? So yeah, one would probably have to sketch out some specific scenario before it really makes sense to think that.
Right. But so these are good arguments why speciesism should imply not accepting the status quo on wild animals. But what do you make of the fact that they haven't been adopted? Like, I guess my concern is I think it's unlikely these views will ever be widely adopted, and therefore we can't just rely on faith that anti-speciesism will eventually come around to understanding these points.
No, I agree very much with that point, actually, that yeah, that's, I mean, when one looks out, there really isn't much cause for optimism, unfortunately. I mean, it is, yeah, when even, even vegans can't at all take that suffering seriously, I mean, what hope is there then? So yeah, I mean, I share your pessimism there, actually.
So that at least downshifts the value of like generic veg outreach.
I'm not sure it necessarily does that. I mean, because I'm not sure that it would make things worse, and I think that was the thing that that it wasn't clear to me whether it actually, that such outreach would have any negative impact, and I don't think I've seen. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that there's any reason to think that is the case. That it reinforces those conservationist intuitions. I mean, I don't know, but it's not clear to me that that's the case.
Right. You could say people are already conservationists, so you're not increasing the net amount of conservationism.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it may, but yeah, I'm not sure. And of course, again, it also does depend on the kind of advocacy, right? I mean, the kind of stuff that Oscar Horta does, I think, it's probably not the first thing they tell people, but it certainly includes it in the material.
Right, yeah. I guess the reason this is more relevant is that most people, even in the effective altruism community, donate to the kinds of charities that Animal Charity Evaluators recommends, ACE recommends. So, and for example, there's a Swiss project called Raising for Effective Giving, which encourages poker players to donate to effective charities, and most of the animal donations are toward ACE's top picks. So it seems important to also evaluate those more conventional approaches, even if it's clear that for your personal donations, it's better to donate to something like Animal Ethics or the Foundational Research Institute that more explicitly recognize wild animal suffering.
Yeah, and I think this also touches upon, I mean, I have to make a little bit of a remark here on this effective altruism movement, because I think there is something very strange going on with their position on non-human animals, because I think it's very confused, actually. It's like there isn't really any clear, I mean, it seems very hypocritical to me, to be honest, that it's like, it seems most effective altruists still eat non-human beings. That just seems, I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. Trying to help some beings while still eating them. Again, I mean, if I try to think of taking in the human context again, it just doesn't make sense, and it seems so antithetical to each other, those two things. So I think, yeah, that it strikes me as very confused, and that's also, to me, it just further underscores the importance of reflection, because I think that's really what's missing. Some clarity about what it takes to help non-human beings. And I think, as I've also written, it's not merely a matter of accepting some positional belief, like we should reject speciesism. I mean, rejecting speciesism, or at least making an effort to, is really a matter of going beyond deeply entrenched attitude, speciesist attitude, I think we have, and it's, it goes much deeper than simply saying, I want to help and donate and improve, quote unquote, animal welfare, which I think it really is confused, and I won't repeat myself, but I've tried to lay out my argument in the piece called Why Happy Meat is Always Wrong, and also my book on speciesism, that I don't think it makes any sense to say that we are trying to help these beings as long as we're eating them. It's just not how the world, and not least human psychology, works. Is my argument. Well, also just ethically, it doesn't really make sense.
The counter argument is usually that it's too much effort to avoid eating animals for certain people, and so it might be cheaper to donate, say, a few $100s a year, which would maybe in expectation have a similar impact.
Yeah, but then again, I think it's important to then take the human context again. I mean, we don't tend to play those kind of words with discrimination in the human case. I mean, people who to abuse humans, we wouldn't keep that going and then say, but I'm donating to some, anti-children abuse, and then it's easier for me. So I think there is a fundamental confusion there going on, I think, and it really is, and it's one that we have to get beyond in order to really improve things, because I think that the state of affairs today are really explained, I think, at least in most developed countries, by this notion that we can eat non-human beings as long as we treat them well. I mean, that's justified, and I think that's the most insidious notion in the whole sphere of human ideas today, at least one of them. That there is this, it's such a strange notion, because I think it's really and that's also what I've seen. I think that's really the rationalization that makes the wheel keep on spinning.
Well, what about something like child labor or blood diamonds or other cases where we do, at least from one perspective, inflict harm on humans without. So, for example, you can campaign for social justice in the US and still buy sweatshop clothing or something. And one reason this is a little complicated is that there's debate about whether you should boycott sweatshop clothing entirely, because then you might just reduce jobs that people seem to prefer to have.
Yeah, but I don't see that as analogous at all, I must say, because I mean, in the case of sweatshops, I mean, we're talking about jobs that people, I mean, it's not like people are dragged to the factories, which they literally are in, the case of non-human beings who are, killed and abused from day one to the last day 56 or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess, I mean, it's not really coherent to ask whether a being would wish to come into existence, but people might say animals would on the whole prefer to exist than not. That would be the logic of the barter. And so
and then again, I have to
voluntary in some sort of hypothetical sense.
Yeah, but then I don't hear anyone make that argument when it comes to humans, and so I'm very curious to hear why they think it's so appealing in the case of non-human beings, but when it comes to humans, it's just so appalling, which I think it is, period. But that's, I mean, very simple question. You never hear any answers to that.
So on the whole, you think, say, the charities that Animal Charity Evaluators recommends are still positive. How would you weigh their value per dollar compared with something like animal ethics?
So I'm not at all qualified to say. I mean, I just don't know. So I shouldn't claim to know at all. It's probably better than nothing, is my estimate. But what I was criticizing was more this whole confused attitude. And I have been in touch with I mean, for instance, animal charity evaluators. I know that some of those who work there anyways would be eating other non-human beings, and that just, I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. And I don't see how that works out, because again, it's really, I think desensitization is a key word in this context, because it's how are you going to think clearly about something? I mean, we're talking about the ethics of certain beings. How are you going to think clearly about that if you eat those beings? And I think we tend to miss how much it screws up our perception, because we're so used to it. And so you really have to step as far out of that whole nasty soup of abuse, step as far out of it as possible in order to have just the slightest chance of being able to look clearly on this issue. And I think, even many vegans don't do that, and it's a lot of work, actually. And I think that's the kind of thing that needs to take place, which isn't to say that it's, I mean, I'm not so hopeful, but I think it's still what I would try to push for. I mean, that sort of deeper change, and I think it's actually possible, because I think at the end of the day, I think it's also the only thing that does make sense, because if one, I mean, the consistent anti-speciesist approach really is, then you get all the points, but of course then you aren't going to make everyone read a book about that. So I don't know what the most effective advocacy really is at the street level. I don't know, unfortunately. But it does seem to me that anti-speciesism is, how can I say, a great idea, but it's hard to sell, really.
It's hard to what?
To sell. I mean, yeah.
Did you have other thoughts on wild animal suffering? For example, do you have thoughts on the net impact of climate change on wild animals?
Well, yeah, we discussed this a bit earlier. Again, I don't really know. It's quite unclear to me how it will impact life in the wild. I think you had some more profound thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I think climate change as well as other big picture issues are both important and also uncertain. There are a few topics like climate change, crop cultivation, ranching, and some other human uses of land that are pretty big in the sense that they occupy a large fraction of the Earth's surface, or are expected to significantly change biomass on Earth. And so climate change is one of those. And the downside of so it's a very important problem, but the downside is that it's very complicated too. Even just predicting the amount of warming and the effects that it will have on humans is something that occupies hundreds or thousands of scientists full time. But it seems we can still try to make some crude assessments using what's known, and that should be better than nothing, given the stakes. So there are a lot of factors in both directions. One concern about why climate change could be bad is it might increase biomass production insofar as sometimes plants do better with more carbon dioxide, and many regions of Earth will become more warm more of the year. So there will be increased growing seasons in northern and in higher latitudes. The flip side is that there will also be more deserts and loss of current rainforests in the tropics and things like that. Another concern is that insect metabolism and growth and reproduction is often linear in temperature above some threshold. So if you have a warmer climate, you may have more breeding seasons per year, and you also have less winter, so insects will be around for longer. And in some cases, insects might survive the winter, which can also mean more population year-round. So from those perspectives, many people expect that insects will increase in population due to climate change, and that seems to be a big concern. On the flip side, there are many estimates that expect zooplankton and phytoplankton to decrease with global warming. These estimates are also noisy, and many studies contradict each other. Even if you use a different model, you get a different direction of impact. But it seems plausible that in the short term, you'd have more reduction, say in expectation over all the models, than increase in zooplankton and phytoplankton. And so if zooplankton matter at least in a comparable degree to insects, then that could be bad. There are about 10 to the 18th to 10 to the 21st, something around that ballpark of zooplankton. And there are 10 to the 18th to 10 to the 19th insects. So zooplankton in numbers are maybe comparable or slightly higher than insects. In terms of per individual sentience, I would put zooplankton maybe at least an order of magnitude lower than the typical insect, insofar as life in the water requires less cognitive performance than life on land. And zooplankton in general seem to be less sophisticated, especially than the more sophisticated insects. But they do engage in escape responses to predators, and they have an interesting neurophysiology. And so I don't think they are trivial in importance either. So it's not really clear how to balance an expected insect increase versus a more speculative expected zooplankton decrease. On balance, it might be net bad if you count the insects more, and because that's more certain, but there are a lot of moving parts to the equation. Another consideration is whether human responses to climate change could be bad. So, for example, some people have proposed fertilizing oceans as a form of geoengineering to sequester carbon, and that would probably be bad if it leads to much greater phytoplankton and therefore zooplankton numbers. One other kind of speculative concern is Earth is expected to go into a cooling phase at some point in the future. It's not clear exactly when it will be, maybe thousands of years from now. If the cooling period is sufficiently close to now, then climate change might delay that period, and therefore it would delay an ice age that would vastly reduce populations. I think there would need to, most climate scientists don't really take the cooling of the Earth as an important consideration, and so I guess the probability of cooling of the Earth intersecting with the period of climate change that matters, like the next 100 years, say, would be a small probability. So it's maybe not a big consideration, but it could be quite significant if it were true, because if climate change delayed an ice age, that would vastly increase total populations relative to the alternative. And the reason I say that the important timeline for climate change is maybe 100 years is that I would guess that at least within a few hundred years, assuming civilization doesn't take a step back for some reason, that the dominant intelligence on Earth would be digital past a few hundred years from now, in which case it seems plausible that the biosphere will be mostly consumed for other uses. And even if that's not the case, at least by that period, people may have AIs and other technologies that would be able to dramatically control climate conditions. So, for example, I mean, in 100 years, it'll probably be easier to undo the effects of global warming, even if we still are biological at that point. So I would guess that we only need to look about 100 years out, plus or minus some error margin, for these questions.
Yeah, I suppose, I don't know how big a factor that is, but with the increasing use of solar panels, I guess we'll also be harvesting more and more sun's energy, and yeah, will be consumed by this human machine civilization.
Yeah. Solar panels are an interesting convergence between environmentalism and animal welfare, insofar as solar panels cover, say, grassland or lawn or some other area that would otherwise lead to photosynthesis. Then solar panels probably reduce wild animal suffering, ignoring climate change impacts and all that, because they prevent plant growth on that region. So that's a nice example to cite to people of where environmentalism doesn't always contradict wild animal suffering. Another related example is the idea of using gravel lawns, at least in areas where you apply a lot of water or fertilizer to your lawn. Fertilizer can contribute to climate change, and mowing uses energy that contributes to climate change. So it's in some cases bad from a climate change perspective, from the perspective of wanting to oppose climate change, to maintain a lawn. And if you cover the lawn with gravel or some other non-biological substance, then you prevent plant growth in that region. And at least some insects and other invertebrates are supported on lawn ecosystems. So you do reduce populations by some amount by doing that. And the main potential downside of this is, apart from the cost to buy the gravel, is that some people say lawns sequester a non-trivial amount of carbon. So if you thought climate change was bad, there are at least some scenarios in which the reduction in carbon sequestration into soil organic carbon can be a worse total effect than the reduction in insect populations. But for other models, that's not the case, and especially if you maintain the lawn by methods that contribute to climate change, then it becomes more plausible that the gravel lawn is a net plus from an environmental perspective, a human-centric environmental perspective. And as far as cost, it depends. I guess gravel is fairly expensive, which is sort of a one factor that reduces my enthusiasm for this strategy. But if you do apply the gravel, you also save the time of mowing and watering and fertilizing and things like that. So as far as longer term ways to spread reduction of wild animal suffering beyond our community, I think an organization that promotes gravel lawns to active lawn managing households could be a reasonable idea, especially since it's win-win from an environment and animal perspective. I also had the related idea that you could even buy land to cover with gravel, because land is pretty cheap actually in parts of the United States and also in third world countries. It's surprisingly cheap to buy a whole several acres of land, and so you could make a non-trivial impact in that way. But I think what's more expensive is actually the gravel, not the land itself.
Yeah, don't you think it would make more sense to cover it with, I don't know, solar panels then? I don't know, just in terms of...
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. As long as it wouldn't have been done by somebody else. But an organization that creates power with solar panels, even if it's slightly less efficient than some other method, if you subsidize it for the wild animal suffering benefits, that could be a reasonable approach.
So yeah, shall we move on perhaps to some different topics?
Sure, yeah, and we can come back if we have more to say.
Yeah.
So do you want to go ahead, or shall we talk about artificial general intelligence next?
Yeah, we can do that. Unless talk about, I don't know whether consciousness should come first. No, I think we'll probably take
whatever you want.
Yeah, well, let's take consciousness then. So I see, I wrote something. Yeah, it was concerning degrees of certainty about the nature of consciousness, as I wrote. I think, I don't know whether it's fair to say that I seem to be a bit more agnostic about the nature of consciousness than you are.
Yeah, I give something like 25% probability to being wrong about my view on consciousness, which is roughly Dennettian eliminativism or type A physicalism, to use Chalmers's terminology. And most of that is from modesty arguments, not because I find it plausible from an inside view that I'm wrong, but other smart people disagree. And in fact, many smart people have many divergent opinions on this question.
Yeah, it just, I don't know, it seems quite strong to me, but then perhaps we should go to for instance, I think the point about, I guess one could call it hardware. So in your view, you're fairly certain then that hardware isn't relevant, or what?
Well, so the disagreement is more fundamental than that, in the sense that I don't think there's a fact of the matter about whether a given system is conscious.
No, yeah, you say that, yeah. Which I don't quite understand. Perhaps I don't know whether, yeah, maybe you can elaborate a bit more.
Yeah, well, so the argument would be similar to, I mean, the standard example is Elan Vital, although Chalmers has pointed out that many people historically didn't view. So I'll give the analogy first. So Daniel Dennett and others have made this point that in the early 1900s and late 1800s, people thought that life could only be explained by some elan vital substance that would animate life, and life could not simply be the result of mechanical operations. And so Dennett claims that this can be directly drawn in analogy with consciousness, that today people think there's a hard problem of consciousness in the sense that material operations in brains are not sufficient to explain why we have consciousness. And so then the eliminativist position on consciousness would be similar to that on Elan Vital, which says that in fact you only need the material operations, and there is no extra substance required to explain what's going on. So Chalmers says that historically it's a little bit disanalogous in the sense that people thought purely in terms of mechanical explanation that material operations would not be sufficient to explain life, whereas so that is, they thought that the operations of enzymes in cells and all things that are part of what constitutes life, that those, even in a physical sense, could not reproduce the observed behavior, whereas Chalmers and most philosophers of consciousness think that we can reproduce all the physical manifestations of consciousness just by physical explanations, and what's missing is only something that explains the phenomenal aspect of consciousness. So there's a little bit of a disanalogy in the like in the what's missing from the explanation, but at least the analogy is also helpful in thinking about what the eliminativist position says. And so